You didn't mean to drift this far from yourself. It just happened slowly, quietly, like a gentle erosion. Not a storm, not a collapse. Just a lifetime of saying yes when you meant no, of being praised when you performed, and overlooked when you were real. Somewhere along the way, goodness became your survival. It wasn't the radiant kind that glows from within. It was the tight, weary kind, the one that smiles when it wants to scream, that stays quiet just to keep the peace, that bows its head, not in reverence, but in resignation. You thought this made you virtuous. You were taught that this made you good. But now, in the quiet moments when your phone's off, when no one's watching, when your breath slows, and your thoughts wander, something else begins to whisper. It's not rage. It's not rebellion. It's something even more frightening than anger clarity. The kind of clarity that doesn't shout. It just sits in your chest and murmurs, "I don't want to keep living this way." And maybe you've tried to ignore it. Maybe you've told yourself it's selfish, that it's just exhaustion, or pride, or some passing storm. But the ache hasn't passed. It's grown quieter, deeper, like roots pressing into dry earth, looking for some place that still feels like home. And maybe that home is you. Not the you that smiles through discomfort. Not the one that earns love by erasing herself. But the one who knows, deep down, she was never meant to be obedient, only whole. They told you it was strength, this ability to swallow your truth, like a bitter pill, and smile anyway. They told you it was grace to nod in agreement when your soul whispered otherwise. And they called it virtue. But maybe what they really meant was silence. A silence that didn't just still your voice, it muted your instincts. It softened your spine. It dimmed the colors of your essence until even you forgot what they once looked like. You see, from the time you were young, you were celebrated for complying, not for questioning. You were loved for staying quiet, not for speaking up. You were told that humility was holy, but only when it meant making yourself small enough to fit someone else's comfort. You didn't get to learn what it meant to trust the shape of your own soul. You only learned how to shrink it. So you confused kindness with self-erasure. You thought compassion meant self-denial. You mistook surrender for obedience and courage for rebellion. But what if all along your silence wasn't virtue? It was training, a soft domestication, a rehearsed disappearance. And now, every time your truth rises like a wave, you hold your breath. You brace for guilt, because the world has taught you to flinch at the sound of your own voice. But healing begins in the place where obedience ends. And healing is not loud. It does not slam doors or shout through megaphones. It just begins. A little tremble in your chest. A whisper you don't ignore this time. A boundary that holds. A no that doesn't need to be explained. And with every small return to yourself, the silence loses power. Not because you're louder, but because you're truer. And the truest things don't have to shout. They just have to breathe. I used to know a woman named Elise. She wasn't famous or flashy. She was the kind of person everyone liked because she never made anything about herself. She always showed up, always listened, always said yes. You know the type, right? The friend who never cancels even when she's exhausted. The coworker who picks up the slack without being asked. The daughter who remembers every birthday but forgets her own needs. She once told me, and I'll never forget this, I don't think anyone actually knows me. They just know the version of me that's helpful. And she wasn't saying it with bitterness. She was saying it with sadness, a kind of quiet grief. Because somewhere between trying to be kind and trying not to be a burden, she forgot how to just be. There was a moment that broke my heart. We were sitting at a cafe, small place, kind of noisy. And I asked her out of nowhere, "What do you want right now?" Not what's practical, not what's polite, just want. She looked out the window for a long time. Then she said, "I don't know. I've never been asked that way." That's when I realized she wasn't living a life. She was managing one, keeping everything running, holding it all together, but never really in it. She wasn't angry. She wasn't lost in any dramatic way. She was just gone, like a ghost of herself. You'd never know it from the outside. She was always smiling in photos, always showing up. But inside, there was no color left. Just grayscale days and nights where she went through the motions. And maybe you know someone like that. Maybe you are someone like that. Maybe you've learned to be so good at disappearing that no one even notices you're missing, not even you. But here's the thing. That version of you, the one who's always available, always agreeable, always, okay, she's not the whole story. There's more. There's the part of you that's been waiting quietly, hoping you'll come back for her. And maybe this is you turning around. I had this conversation once, late at night, with someone I care about deeply. He looked at me and said, "I just want to be a good man." And for some reason, it made me pause. Because I could see the weight behind those words. Not a proud declaration, but a burden. A deep, tired ache that said, "I don't know who I am if I'm not pleasing someone." And that struck something in me. Because how many of us are walking around with that exact same ache, wanting to be kind, fair, generous. But underneath that, there's fear. Fear of being misunderstood. Fear of seeming selfish. Fear of being seen as anything other than good. You start saying yes when you're tired. You apologize for things that aren't your fault. You hold your tongue even when something inside you is screaming. And it feels like virtue, like maturity, like nobility. But sometimes it's just fear in disguise. Fear wearing a halo. I'm not saying kindness is wrong, or that humility is weakness. What I'm saying is, when goodness becomes a set of rules you can never question, you're not free. You're just obedient. And eventually, that obedience starts to cage you. It becomes harder and harder to tell the difference between your true values and your survival strategies. You forget what's coming from your heart and what's just habit. It's like you're still in the room, but not really there. Your smile arrives, but your soul stays behind. You stop asking yourself, is this true for me? And instead, ask, will this make me lovable? Will this make me safe? And that's when, you're not choosing goodness. You're trying to earn your place. But what if you didn't have to? What if being good didn't mean being small? What if the most radical thing you could do was tell the truth, even when it's messy? To love without losing yourself. To serve without self-erasing. Because real goodness isn't fearful. It's grounded. It's clear. It's free. And you were never meant to shrink to fit inside someone else's version of worthy. You were meant to grow so fully that the light pouring out of you could never be mistaken for obedience. There's a small pottery shop not far from where I live. Tucked between a florist and a bakery, it's easy to miss. But one day, I wandered in looking for a gift. And I met a man there, older, soft-spoken hands covered in clay. He told me he'd been making pots for over 30 years. Beautiful ones, balanced, symmetrical, technically perfect. They sold well. People admired his work. But then he paused, smiled a little, and said, "Funny thing is, I didn't enjoy any of it." I was surprised, but why, I asked. He looked at the shelf behind him full of flawless vases, and he said something I'll never forget. I spent so long trying to make what others would praise, I forgot what I actually loved making. He walked to the back and showed me a different shelf. Uneven mugs with bold colors, strange curves, pots shaped like rivers, suns and stories. "These," he said, "these are mine." They weren't perfect. Some wobbled, some cracked. But they were alive, full of soul, full of risk. He said these didn't come from trying. They came from joy, from letting the clay speak instead of forcing it into something polite. And then he added, almost like a confession, "I only started making these after I let go of trying to be good." That stayed with me, because I think a lot of us are like that potter. We've become so good at shaping ourselves into what others admire, what sells, what fits, that we forget what it feels like to move from joy, not performance. There's a different kind of strength that doesn't shout or prove or strive. It just flows. It creates. It gives. Not from duty, but from aliveness. When you stop trying to be enough, you start remembering that you already are. That's when your voice softens, your hands steady, and your heart finally has room to breathe again. Have you ever watched sunlight pour through a window? Not aiming, not performing, just arriving. It doesn't pick favorites. It doesn't wait to be invited. It doesn't wonder, did I shine enough today? It just shines. Because that's what light does when it's full. That's the kind of giving we often forget exists. Because most of us were raised to believe that giving is noble only when it hurts. That goodness means effort. That kindness requires sacrifice. That love, real love, always comes with a little bleeding. But that's not true. At least, not entirely. Yes, love can stretch us. Yes, giving asks something of us. But it doesn't always have to cost your soul. I once heard someone say, "You can't pour from an empty cup," but I think they missed something. You also can't pour when your cup is only half full, because then every drop feels like a loss, a depletion, a transaction. But when your cup is full, truly deeply full, you don't even realize you're pouring. It spills naturally, from laughter, from clarity, from that deep inner knowing that says, I don't have to give everything to be enough. But I also don't have to hoard my heart to stay safe. True generosity, the kind that nourishes instead of empties, comes from wholeness, not from hunger. It's not look at how much I've given. It's this is too beautiful not to share. When you're overflowing, you stop needing applause. You stop asking, was that enough? Because you know it was never about keeping score. It was about being so grounded in yourself that you could let life move through you, like light through glass, clear, honest, and without hesitation. Have you ever packed a box you weren't ready to open again? Maybe it was an old journal, a photo album, a sweater that smelled like a version of you barely recognize anymore. We all carry things we don't want to face, but we also carry versions of ourselves that we're scared to release. I think we all have a version of us that's quietly dying. The version that was built to please. The one that kept the peace at any cost. The one that smiled through things she should have walked away from. And sometimes the hardest part of healing is realizing that those parts of us were never mistakes. They were necessary. They kept us safe. They got us here. But they were never meant to carry us forever. There's a quiet death that happens when you stop being who the world trained you to be. It doesn't look like a breakdown. It's not loud or dramatic. It's the slow unlearning of survival habits that once felt like home, but now feel like a cage. It's realizing, I don't need to say yes to be loved. I don't need to be small to be safe. I don't have to perform to be worthy. It's a shedding, not a loss, but a return. A return to something quieter, more rooted, less obedient, but more honest. I remember talking with a friend who was right in the middle of it. She said, "It feels like I'm mourning someone who's still alive me." And I understood, because letting go of your old self isn't just freeing, it's grief. It's confusing. It's lonely sometimes. But there's beauty in that, because grief means something mattered. And maybe finally what matters most is you. Not who you pretended to be, not who you were praised for being, but the part of you that's always been waiting to breathe. And maybe this is that breath, right here, right now. There's a kind of silence that heals, not the awkward kind, not the kind filled with tension, but the kind that wraps around you like warm dusk after a long, chaotic day. It's the kind of silence where you finally stop performing, stop proving, stop bracing for disappointment. You just are. And at first, it can feel uncomfortable, like an empty room with nothing to distract you. But if you stay just a little longer, you start to hear something softer. Your own voice. Not the loud, confident one, but the fragile whisper underneath the one that says, "I miss me." We live in a world that fears stillness. If you stop posting, you're forgotten. If you're not productive, you're lazy. If you're quiet, people ask, "Are you okay?" But maybe quiet is not a crisis. Maybe it's a homecoming. I knew someone who used to take 3 days offline every month. No phone, no people. Just long walks, candles, books, and silence. People thought she was eccentric, but she told me it was the only way she could remember who she was, beneath the roles, the routines, the noise. "I don't disappear," she said. "I return." And that stuck with me ever since. Because sometimes the strongest thing you can do is not show up for the expectations. Sometimes the most radical act is to pause. To stop running, stop explaining, stop trying to be seen, and instead, be still. Let yourself be quiet enough to hear what's been buried. Because in that silence, you don't just rest. You reset. You rebuild. You remember. So if you've been feeling the need to go quiet for a while, to log off, tune out, breathe in, that's not weakness. That's your soul saying it's time to come home. Coming home to yourself is not a grand event. It doesn't always come with fireworks or revelation. Sometimes it looks like saying no without explaining. Sometimes it's the deep breath you take before answering a message and choosing not to. It's small, almost invisible to the outside world. But to you, it feels like returning from a war you didn't realize you were fighting. Because the truth is, you were never broken. You were just busy trying to survive in a world that benefits from your confusion. You've worn masks so long they felt like skin. You've smiled through clenched teeth, nodded while shrinking, loved while slowly disappearing. But the ache you feel, it's not failure. It's the sound of your spirit knocking, asking gently but persistently, "Can I come back now?" And maybe now you're ready, not to fix yourself, not to impress anyone, but to be whole again on your own terms. You don't owe anyone your constant availability. You don't have to explain the shift in your energy. You don't need to justify the boundaries that protect your peace. You are allowed to be soft and powerful, kind and honest, loving and still fiercely committed to your own becoming. And no, this path isn't easy, but it's worth everything. Because with each step back toward your truth, you reclaim your voice, your rhythm, your life. So maybe today you let yourself rest without guilt. Say no without fear. Cry without apology. Smile just for yourself. Because that's how healing happens. Not in loud declarations, but in quiet, faithful returns to who you were before the world taught you to forget.